So Chapman, I want to get right into this because we have a lot to talk about. But because this is sort of the first time that you're coming onto the channel that we're interacting, really, why don't you give me like an elevator pitch on yourself? Like, who are you? What do you do? And why do you think you're worth listening to?
So my day job, I'm a CPA, and basically I decided to start investing in the uranium market a couple of months ago, and I just kind of dove right into it, and I started doing some just kind of really, I like to think of them as pretty in-depth dives into things. Um, so yeah, it's basically I'm a certified public accountant. I can read financial statements. This is a skill I think that's pretty important when it comes to investing. Um, I also I like to have explanations for things. So I think it all has to. I think what I'm really good at is basically putting it in a larger picture here. Like, one of the things I've been really doing lately is I've been actually going back and I've been looking at the last bull run of uranium. What happened? How did it start? How did it end? Who were the players? Who were the winners? Who were the losers? The past informs the future, a lot of times. So
Yeah.
pretty
Well, this is going to
easy.
be an interesting conversation, Chapman, I think, because
I
you
hope
you
so.
reached out. Yeah, but you
Yeah,
reached out and
yeah,
you told me that you know of a laser that is going to zip right through the uranium bull thesis. I was like, okay, I'll give it a minute to talk about that here in a second as well.
yeah.
Before that, though, I want to sort of pick it up somewhere, and an important thing that happened this week is that we heard um is it an announcement? Is it a rumor that
I call it a
The Biden
rumor.
administration is gonna they're hoping to push lawmakers to give them, they're throwing out different numbers, but let's call it $4.3 billion, which
Sure.
they say that they'll use to, well, which the rumor or whatever it is says that they'll use to support the domestic uranium
Hmm.
market.
Hmm.
But this might not be specifically to buy uranium. And so the CEO of Sprott Inc. tells me that whatever it is, though, and whether it passes or it doesn't, it's already been a meaningful piece of news as it
Hmm.
shows the sentiment within the government.
Sure.
But I hear that you might have a different opinion. So why don't you maybe take it back? Why don't you dumb down that news release for me and tell me what do you think it means for us, the degenerates who are heavily leveraged towards uranium?
So the one thing that was really key in that source that I think a lot of people initially may have skipped over is enriched, domestic enriched sources. So this is talking about enrichment basically, which is our biggest issue right now, in that we have about 4 million SWU that we get from Russia. This is enrichment services. But essentially, if we want to bring enrichment back home, we're going to have to build an enrichment facility.
But so
So
this is
this
not
is
for LEU. This is not
it
for
is for LEU.
fuel.
Yeah, I mean, it would be for LEU, low enriched uranium. Yeah, most likely. Um, and it's you have essentially you have different levels of uranium. You have natural assay uranium, which is like 0.7%, something like that. And then you have LEU, which is 0.5, zero point 0.4 to 0.5%. And then you have HALEU, which is 20%, and then highly enriched, which is like 80. Um, so this is all about the enrichment side of things. It's not necessarily about U3O8. I mean, eventually, yeah, you're going to have to solve the U3O8 question, because you're going to need more. You're going to need more of it. But not. This is not about that, in my opinion. It's not about buying. We're not gonna. It's really not about buying huge amounts of uranium in the ground.
What
I
is
mean,
it
this
going to be
is
used like for to build out another conversion facility or something like that? Because I think the U.S. only has
uh
one. Or
Honeywell Converdyne could probably cover whatever needs that we need. And they are supposed to come back up. I haven't heard any press announcements, interestingly, lately. You also have Cameco, they have a conversion facility. So this would be the step after conversion, which is basically where, you're along the lines, you've got uranium ore, you make it into U3O8, yellow cake, Then you convert it into UF6, which is uranium hexafluoride. Then you take that uranium hexafluoride, and if it's heated up just a little bit, it becomes a gas. Then you enrich it through whatever means. There's several different ways you can go about that. And then from there, that's converted into ceramic fuel pellets. So there's 4 stages in this process. And we're talking about stage 3, because that's sort of the point of the problem at this moment in time.
And this is not official set in stone yet, right?
Oh, no. No. This is the interesting thing. Or the question I had about this was like, where's this source coming from? Who is it? Is this someone high up in DOE, or is this like an unpaid, congressional intern that heard a rumor? It just, has a source at Bloomberg or something like that because they went to college together. Who knows? The numbers they're throwing out make sense in a lot of ways if you wanted to replace that 4 million SWU. But nothing is set in stone yet. And again, this is going to come down to what Congress wants to do. So Congress is going to ultimately determine what this program is going to be. And that's going to take some negotiation.
How does this relate, though, to some of the official news that those were official news from, I guess, about mid last month? The announcement that essentially the Department of Energy would start downblending highly enriched uranium, so HEU, and some speculated that it would be, they'd be taking it from HEU, so highly enriched uranium that's above 20%. They'd be taking it to between 5 and 20%, which is the HALEU. That's the fuel used in test reactors, as I understood it, not commercial reactors that we have today, but test reactors like SMR and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But some people said that like Art Hyde, for example, on Twitter said that that's definitely not going to be going from HEU to LEU, so it's not going to hit the uranium supply market. So just again, just sort of, I guess, if you could sort of link those two, is there a link between them? And could you also dumb it down for me?
Well, I don't think there's a link between that, the downblending of HEU and this announcement. They're separate things, in my opinion.
Okay.
The downblending of HEU would be, it's kind of unknown as to what they want to use it for. I mean, like I said, Art Hyde, and there's a couple of other people. I've made some guesses on it as to what exactly they're going to do with it. There's no, I haven't seen any official paper that has explained what they're going to do with it. My opinion is that they will take this. They may make some HALEU level enrichment uranium with it, and they could make some LEU. I think it's probably going to be maybe a combination of both. You'll have some LEU that will basically be an emergency backstop to if a reactor cannot get enriched fuel. They will use that, and that will be, because once you refuel a reactor, it's good for like 16 months. So it could be a bit of both, basically. They could also, who knows? They could be making LEU to feed the Centrus. We're getting into that thing there, but I mean, there's a lot of things that they could do with it. It could just be almost, it could be testing the feasibility of the whole thing. Like, what would this entail? How much is it going to cost? Just basically almost like a test, essentially. Like, they're having to think about all their different options to bridge this enrichment gap problem that we have, because it's obviously, it's going to take several years before you get any more enrichment capacity online. And
what impact do you think that's going to have on the LEU market, though? Like, if we're sort of being realistic, just a wild ass guess, how much of LEU supply would that add to the market if it were to happen? Because I saw some numbers, and I want to give all the credit to the people that's due. Clay Montgomery on Twitter, he was making some calculations and saying that it could be the equivalent of 170 million pounds of U3O8, So that is a
That's if you
scary
like,
number.
if you take like all of the stockpile, yes, you could do that. But then we'd have no HEU left.
So it could, I mean, the possibilities there for it
Very
to go to
unlikely.
LEU, but or
Well, it's very unlikely that they would take it all to LEU because then we'd have no HEU, and we need HEU for the Navy because
right.
we don't have a nuclear Navy if we don't have HEU, and we don't really have any way to make HEU right now easily. It's a fairly energy intensive process, so it is a national stockpile for a reason. Like it's a security. It is a strategic stockpile, and it's not like a strategic stockpile like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This isn't just, well, fingers crossed, but that they don't decide to treat it like that. But it's not something that just you would just get rid of on a whim. I mean, this would have to be. They would only really get rid of this. They would only start downblending this into LEU if it was like a dire national emergency. So they are going to like national emergency, like we're out of fuel and half of our reactors are about to shut down. That's like the level of national emergency I'm talking about here.
Well, that could happen though, right? Given that there's not much production.
Potentially, I mean, it's like they have a lot of uranium in the stockpile. So, and we're going to know, like I said, the utilities have not been publicly panicking about this. So the question of, how much of an issue this may be is, who knows?
When you say they have a lot of uranium in the stockpile, though, what are you talking about? U3O8, like yellow cake or LEU?
Well, they have it's along the lines of several different levels along the nuclear supply chain. So you have U3O8, which is about 20 million pounds. And they've kept about 20 million pounds of it for the past several years. Then you have UF6, which is the second stage. It's the second stage of the process. That's conversion. That has been, I believe, grab a paper here real quick. That has been actually going down quite a bit. So that's, essentially you would take that and that's what you enrich, essentially. What has been going up for utilities is the enriched UF6. So, because they've been buying as much of it as they can. And then as well, you have the fabricated fuel, which is fuel bundles that are basically just ready to go into a reactor. The only thing that went up in 2021 was the enriched UF6, because that's what they're buying. I think you had Jim Pelchet on maybe a week or two ago, and they're going to buy the closest thing. Like he said, and I totally agree with it, that they're going to buy the closest thing to fuel. And that's what they're doing. The worrying thing for potential for the utilities is that natural UF6 continues to go down. And that makes total sense. Honeywell Converdyn has been shut down for, it's approaching 6 or 7 years now, I think. Because I think they went offline in 2016 or 2017, just because we had so much of it, and that supply of that material has been steadily going down. So it rested a little bit in 2021, I believe, but it's not. It wasn't going down by about the same rate it has been. But essentially, if we have to start overfeeding, I know I'm getting. Stop me if I'm getting too far ahead. Then that number is going to go down really quick because then you're using more of it essentially.
Right.
So.
Right. What? No, you're talking about all these different steps, and I have been trying to go through the comments and see what companies are referenced in there. And people would mention Centrus. People would mention Silex. So who can do all that? Like the thing that the government is going to be paying for, who's going to make money on the other? The simplest of questions that I could come up with, from my understanding, the government has let's imagine it that way. The government has a pile of cash. Who's going to make that pile of cash?
Well, I think there's going to be a bidding process. It's This isn't just going to be a contract that's just magically handed to somebody. There's going to be a bidding process for it. You're going to have, you mentioned Centrus, you mentioned Silex. There's going to be two other companies that are also going to show up to this. And that's going to be Urenco and Orano. So the French and the German, Netherlands, British consortium, which is Urenco, and then you have the French, which is Orano. So Orano might pull out of their they had plans for an enrichment facility in Idaho, but they mothballed it because we didn't need enrichment capacity over the bull market period because we were underfeeding. So those are three companies. Those are the four companies that will show up to that process, and they will all stand a potentially, well, three of them will stand a pretty decent chance of getting the contract. One of them will not, in my opinion, anyway. And because they don't have any money, and that's going to be Centrus because they just don't have money. So, again, we'll see how that all goes. But essentially, it's not there. There's several players to this. Urenco is going to be the one. They have an existing facility in New Mexico. And they have said publicly that they're more than happy to potentially expand that facility at their own cost, but they would need the orders. So, it's all kind of, it's up in the air. I mean, and we don't even really know what DOE wants to do, but yes, there's going to have to be an expanded enrichment. Those four companies are going to be the people that show up to the party, essentially trying to get a piece of cake. So
does that make them attractive from an investor standpoint? I guess only Silex's interest would be the only options. Or
unfortunately, yes, because Urenco is basically government backed, and so is Orano, which makes a lot of sense. Nuclear is 60% of nuclear is essentially, particularly even on the mining side of things, like 60% is government controlled or government backed companies that are not publicly traded. So, you do have two options. Silex is probably, they have a bit of a technology advantage potentially over all of their competitors because they would be using a different technology, whereas everyone else will basically show up with centrifuges, and they're going to show, and Silex will show up with lasers and say, and the lasers will solve a lot of DOE's problems. So they have some, it depends on, it just depends on what DOE, I guess, wants to do, and, DOE has a big problem in depleted UF6 tails that they don't really know what to do with. And there's a lot of it. And Silex is the only company that can enrich those economically. And that has some thesis implications. So that, I think a lot of people have not thought about all that well. So, but that's what so this is part of my thing where I'm trying to, you're always trying to find, particularly in the uranium space, you're always trying to find the disruptive players, because that's end up what happens. Either you have a huge mine discovery, I'm talking like Husab in the last cycle, or, you have disruptive technology or solutions to issues like, say, underfeeding that just, upends the thesis. So,
when you talk about the technology that Silex has, the laser technology, basically, is that a sure thing? Like that works? It's profitable. They can start it up, or how should I look at that?
So, Silex would be using what some people would call a third generation laser tech. The DOE messed around with lasers back in the 80s, but they just, it never got on. in a lot of reasons, in a lot of ways, it never came to fruition. It was a bit more labor intensive than maybe it needed to be. There's also the issue that plagues enrichment in general, which is the proliferation trolls, who have been the silent killers of nuclear power for probably decades. So, how ready is it for prime time? That's sort of an interesting question. But, if the technology is, even the centrifuges, this is sort of, there's some secrets here. There's a lot of trade secrets as to how all these things work. There's a lot of national security secrets for how these things work. Silex is, their technology is actually classified by a joint agreement of the Australian and the US governments. So the only place that technology can actually be developed and put into a commercial scale is the United States, and unless Australia changes their laws in terms of a ban on uranium enrichment. So, how ready is it for prime time? I mean, they've been testing it for the past several years. So, at the GLE facility in Wilmington, which is where GE is, and that's and that's one of the fuel fabrication facilities actually as well. They share a site basically, and that's where they've been essentially developing this. They have made some moves recently about potentially pushing up the commercialization of it, and they also recently had that announcement with Constellation, which is basically like big nuclear in the United States. They operate 25% of all the reactors in the United States. They are basically the big people. And that was kind of a big deal, because now you have much more so than I think people will give it credit for. Because the last enrichment facility in the United States was Urenco, and that was built with also utility support. Now, the utilities were eventually bought out of it, but the utilities backed it, which is very important because the utilities are the people that ultimately buy this stuff. So if you have the biggest utility that is now backing this potentially disruptive technology, this is something that investors need to take a look at more seriously. And it's, like I said, it has some pretty... depending on the size of the facility is how much of a thesis implications it has, but it solves a lot of problems. So
It solves a lot of problems.
Oh yeah.
For the government, but does it not add potential additional supply to the market, to the uranium market, if the technology works?
Well, the supply to the market, yeah, you would be supplying enriched UF6 to the market. And there's so much of it that's above the ground that, okay, so for instance, at the Paducah facility and the Piketon facility, which is where the old gaseous diffusion plants existed, which was the Cold War era way that we enriched uranium. Very, very energy intensive. It's many things. Efficient is not one of them. And that basically involves, pushing uranium hexafluoride through a series of screens that has little teeny tiny holes, and you have to keep the system pressurized. So, and because of, I don't know, inverse square law or something along those lines, who knows, something about that, where, if you have a gas that's constantly expanding, it's going to lose pressure. So you have to keep the system pressurized. So along the way, you're going to have all of these little spinning turbines that basically keep the system pressurized. So it uses an enormous amount of power. All that said, because of that, it doesn't, you might have used more uranium in the past with that technology, and you may not have enriched it quite as hard as you would with centrifuges. So you have a lot of assay left in these tails, and there's tons of it. We're talking like 200 or 740,000 metric tons of the stuff. You can see it on a satellite image. It's like they look like propane tanks, and they're just full of it. And the assay that you have in these tails is going to be anywhere between 0.4 and 0.2. So you split the difference and say 0.3. So there's about, let's say, 5 million pounds of uranium-235 in these tails. That's just the U-235. So you take that and you make it into just LEU, and you have enough enriched uranium to power every reactor in the United States for almost 15 years. That's huge. You know, imagine taking every single reactor out of the market for uranium for 15 years. Yeah, that's you're in a new bear market. Now, again, that depends on how big they would potentially build this facility at Paducah. What they've talked about in the past is essentially, in terms of a mine, it would produce 5 million pounds a year, essentially, of U3O8 equivalent natural UF6, actually. That was the original business plan, was that they were just going to enrich these tails to a natural state. And then from there, it would go on to whoever else. They wouldn't actually enrich it to a higher level. They can, but the issue and their sort of their what they were pitching to DOE was like, hey, we can solve this problem for you, because DOE has to do something with these all these tails of UF6. They can't. There's some transuranics in them, so they can't quite just convert them back into yellow cake and, you know, bury it. So there's some issues there. But if you make a business case for it, then, you know, you can have Silex that comes in and essentially enriches these tails. And because of the specific technology of lasers, the magic of it is that it just targets. They use a laser to essentially excite some way or another. Again, the technology is classified. Who knows how it actually all ends up working? But essentially, you have a laser that targets just the U3O8, or sorry, just the U235. So it can economically enrich even the lowest assay tails, because again, it's just you're running the uranium hexafluoride through past these lasers, and the lasers are just basically just essentially collects the material that you need. And it can do it very cheaply, because again, it's just because it's very, very efficient, in other words. And this is sort of why also it hasn't been developed in the past, because it was potentially too inefficient, and it also takes up a smaller area. So you get like the proliferation trolls that come out of nowhere that are really concerned about a classified technology ending up in the hands of a foreign power. You know, they have excuses. But like if you Google laser enrichment, you know, and you start looking at it, you'll notice a pattern, like proliferation. So there's a lot of people that had it just all they said proliferation concerns, and that's potentially what killed laser 2.0 technology. But this is laser 3.0 technology, and it comes at a time when it's needed. It solves a problem of DOE, which is what do they do with all this essentially waste byproduct of the old gaseous diffusion plants, and it can do it economically. So it's like the fire's hot here, and it is one of those potentially, like I said, it's a hugely potentially disruptive technology. And if they're smart, if DOE is smart, because this will basically put the United States back in the driver's seat of world enrichment, because nobody else would be able to compete with us on cost. You know, DOE is practically going to give this material to them for free. And also remember, it skips 2 steps of the process. You're not having to mine it, and you're not having to do the conversion. So they have this cheap material that DOE is pretty much just going to give to them, because they need to get rid of it. and they're going to be able to take that material and they're going to be able to enrich it to whatever enrichment level you want. They actually recently updated their investor presentation where they said, "Oh yeah, we can do all of this," like, and they can. So they are, I think they're very motivated, and you can see that. You can also see it in their stock price because it's going up. So they were actually the only thing that in Australia yesterday, well, other than I think the ERA was up, but all the other U stocks were down. Silex was up yesterday, and I think it was by about 6% or something like that. So it's pretty consistently, and it was high volume. Like they've had for the past week, they've had triple the average volume. So much so they've had so much volume that they actually end up running out of buyers, and then the stock actually comes down because it runs up to like 10%, then comes back down to 6% almost every day. So it's something that I am invested in just as a. I'm not saying like stop investing in mines. It's almost just more of like a hedge, basically. It's a hedge on a potentially disruptive technology that it's sort of like a win-win situation, because in my opinion, they're probably going to get the contract simply because they've got, they have Constellation's backing, and where Constellation goes, a lot of other people will follow. They also have Cameco's backing. What do these companies have? Money. So, and the more money that private industry can bring to the table, the less money that DOE has to hand out. And DOE is going to like that. Now, DOE they're going to want to do something. They're going to want to have some money into it because they want to have some control of the process and some say in it. So, but the more money that private industry, publicly traded private industry, we hope, brings to the table, the better it is for investors, really. So,
but essentially, if this works, that's not good news for the uranium developers, producers, explorers, whatever. It's actually not good for uranium stocks in general. But despite that, let's call it bearish thesis, you're still invested in uranium developers, if I recall correctly. So how come?
Well, you're going to need more U308. I mean, no matter what you do. I mean, either because you're going to be starting to overfeed, or I don't think that they're going to build a 15 million SWU facility at Paducah. They might build a 4 million SWU facility. And even then, they can still enrich regular UF6. And that's probably going to be more cost advantageous for them. And guess what's right next door to Paducah? Honeywell Converdyn. It's literally right across the river. I mean, it's a hop, skip away. So they can, this is the lovely thing about Centrus, is that they can exist in whatever cycle the fuel market is in, because they can enrich tails, they can enrich regular UF6, they can pretty much do whatever you want them to do, assuming of course the technology is ready for prime time. And it probably is. Otherwise, I don't think Constellation would be potentially backing them. And I don't think Cameco would have also bought out GE Hitachi either. I mean, they know that this works, so but they have to have some assurances, I think. But
I think I get your thesis on, for example, now you're bringing up Boss Energy, I guess, and their project. Yeah. But what about the American uranium companies, though? I guess essentially those would be, how many is there? Like, yeah, you've got UR Energy, which I own. No. I own all of them. I guess just fair disclaimer, not confession. But UR Energy, you got Encore, you have Energy Fuse. Maybe throw in Western in there if they ever decide to do something, and then you have that Adnani venture, which I don't know much about. I don't follow it at all. But then, so those are set to benefit from any government incentive, right? Because you're gonna need domestic supply, and potentially, right? But especially Encore, URG, definitely Energy Fuse. They got the mill, and so how come you're not into those? What am I missing there?
So Energy Fuels, I don't know what they want to be. They act like they want to be a uranium company, but if they're going down and finding some property in Brazil, and they're going to then ship that which I haven't even seen a business case for yet. Like, it makes me really suspect. But they're going to ship some rare earth ore all the way from the coast of Brazil to southwestern Utah, which is quite a ways away, to a facility that doesn't have rail line access, mind you. That's telling me that they don't have much confidence that that facility is ever going to see uranium anytime soon. And there's essentially you can take uranium in the United States and you can divide it into three categories. You have Wyoming, you have in situ resources in Texas, and then you have conventional mines in the Four Corners area: Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. I don't have much confidence that a conventional mine is going to see the light of day for a very long time. One, it's such a low resource, and it's in such an area that is just very outside of Utah anyway, and maybe a little bit of Colorado. A lot of it is in Arizona and New Mexico, and these are two jurisdictions that are just not all that friendly to uranium mining. There's also the fact that you potentially will have to ship some of this ore to the white
White Mesa Mill.
White Mesa, yeah, the White Mesa Mill, and you're going to have to basically truck that through the Navajo and the Ute Mountain reservations. That's going to be a discussion. So, I do have some degree of confidence that we will see some uranium in Wyoming and maybe a little bit in Texas. But so I would say, Wyoming, because Wyoming is the most mining friendly jurisdiction probably in the world. I don't think you'd find anybody else that's more miner friendly there. I think the big players that I wouldn't say the big player. The deposit that I'm somewhat cautiously optimistic about is Lance for Peninsula. If they've figured out the in situ problems that they ran into, which was kind of low in situ yields, then they could, they've got a fairly decent sized deposit there. So we'll see how that goes. But I mean, essentially, like you go back, and you look at Nichols Ranch, for instance, they had such low yields there. I mean, and using their words, those well fields at Nichols Ranch are depleted. They would have to drill more well fields to turn that resource on. That's their word, by the way, not mine. That's in their, this is sort of what I talk about sometimes, and that you can find these things. They might be in a 300-page 10K, but I guarantee you they're there. It's going to be a little line, but they have to disclose these things. I mean, that's the way that publicly traded companies work in the United States is, you disclose the risk factors and investors make their decisions from there. I think URG, they would stand some chance because again, they're in Wyoming and they do have in situ resources there. So, but I think anything conventional is just, the best one is probably Rasha Honda. I mean, that's where you have the highest resource. But again, that's the one I talked about earlier, where you're going to have to either have to build a mill there, which is going to be expensive, or you have to truck it to White Mesa, which is going to be a conversation, like I said. So, this is all just, I mean, my due diligence process is relentless and unforgiving. When you find and you consider all of these mines that do eventually, actually come online, it's very few of them. So if you have any red flag along the way, it's just your risk factor for that deposit just goes way up. And it's not to say that, some of this does depend on an individual's investor's own thesis. How high do you think uranium is going to go? For instance, if uranium goes to $150 a pound, all bets are off. I mean, pretty much everyone will have economic feasibility at that point because it's just going to be so ridiculously profitable. But if uranium, ends up around $100, I mean, even then, a lot of these resources in the United States are, I mean, we did a lot of mining in the United States, and a lot of these resources in the Four Corners areas are X mines, mines that were in production in the past. So how much of the good uranium is left, in other words? So I think it's one of those things where I think on the mining side of things, the easy money's gone. We're not trading. It's not like 2019 or 2020 when all of these mines are trading for cash value. I mean, these days, in my opinion, there's still a lot of money to be made. And even though I have my somewhat, you might say, bear thesis with Silex, I kind of think of Silex as more of a hedge. I don't really think of it as, because the facility is just not going to be, they're not going to build a huge facility that's going to have that much of thesis implications there. And even then, it'll probably be 4 or 5 million SWU, if I had to guess. And so, that still doesn't account for the fact that you have to take into account that the Japanese are bringing their reactors back online. The Chinese are building a ton of reactors. Everybody's is going to start building reactors here.
Yeah. So your worst bear thesis does not destroy the uranium investment. That's what you're saying.
No. I mean, it might affect some, it could affect some potential. Let's put it this way. How much of an effect is it going to have on the ultimate U3O8 price that we're going to settle on? I don't really know, to be honest with you. I think it has some potential. It is a disruptive technology, and that is something that people do need to be aware of, and it's something to keep track of. I mean, I on my Substack, I've actually written, I had a case of bull and bear cases for, let's say, Centrus and Silex. And these are just things that, if you start hearing about proliferation a lot out of Congress, like they're really concerned about proliferation, this doesn't bode well for Silex, unfortunately. So who knows? I mean, there's multiple different ways that this could go. It could also be that Orano and Urenco just bring too much money to the table. Like they're willing to do this out of pocket. Then it's like, well, okay, darn. So, and then in that case, you might only get like a smaller size facility for Silex. But eventually, Australia is going to start building reactors. I mean, if they want to decarbonize, they're going to have to. And Silex they could potentially build a facility in Australia. I view Silex as actually a long-term investment.